you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I know it's kind of early, and we are excited that you are all here with us, talking about something that I particularly believe is super important in an agile transformation, a lean journey. And I'd like to welcome our guests here and have a little bit of an introduction. I'm Tissiana Costa. I'm a senior manager with CI&T, and I have been working with digital marketing solutions using Agile and Lean for quite a while.
Hi, I'm Thomas Stubbs. I'm at Coca-Cola. I run engineering and innovation for the Freestyle machine, which is the nifty machine that you see around. You can pour dozens and sometimes hundreds of different drinks. I have a background in interactive marketing, and before that I had a long career building successful and unsuccessful startups, all pre-cloud. In fact, some of them might have done a lot better in the modern era with the cloud. And well, that's me.
Thank you.
Perfect. Brandon Jung, and I'm with Google. I currently run our tech partnerships and ecosystem for our cloud platform. Hopefully, we've done a decent job marketing in the last year, and people actually know what that is. If not, we should chat. And then historically speaking, I've worked with CI&T for about 5 years. And they've worked with work they've delivered for us at Google. And then historically been at Google about 7 years, was at IBM about 10 before.
Braxton Woodham, CTO at Fandango, which after a series of acquisitions now encompasses Fandango.com, Movies.com, Rotten Tomatoes, Fandango Now for video on demand. And then we've recently gotten into Brazil with Ingresso.com down there. So kind of a portfolio of media properties that are all starting to come together, but very disparate at this stage. And then also co-founder, board member at Sunbasket, which is an early stage startup that's in the meal kit space, currently North America only.
Thank you. Okay. So to start our conversation, I would like to ask you guys a question that I've seen debated a lot. When you talk about DevOps, there is a wide spectrum where you can be, right? You can have nothing, or you can be at NoOps, the green stage, right? So you define where you are, and you define where you want to be. And my question to you is, when you move from point A to point B, how is this transition done? Can this transition be done gradually, or we need to have an all-in, all-out kind of jump?
I'll take a crack at that. We went straight to NoOps, but in a very, very point way with our FIFA World Cup campaign, which was done on Google's cloud platform and with help from CI&T. But it's not really a point A to point B thing. It's that was a one little drop in the puddle, and the rest of the DevOps journey is still going on and is for sure gradual. Teams with hundreds of people, I don't think, can go from traditional on-premise ops to DevOps or NoOps overnight. It's much a cultural shift as much as it is a technology shift to shift accountability left upstream to the developers. So I think it's not a point A to point B, and it's not certainly not a big bang, not in an organization like ours.
What about you guys?
I think it has to be culturally, so I guess maybe it can take this from maybe two directions. Looking at either from a company that started NoOps, like maybe like a Snapchat, or that said, hey, absolutely NoOps, and they become more so they've actually moved back down the scale as they've needed more flexibility from their business, and you can read all this out there, or I'm happy to have a conversation. And as they've grown, they need to build some expertise. So they started with really no expertise other than, hey, we're just going to go as fast as possible and build. So I guess extreme DevOps might be one way of saying it, or NoOps. And I've seen them actually come back a bit to really understanding the underlying infrastructure and even in the way they develop, being a little bit more systematic than they might have when they first started. Having the ability to move back down that is both a cultural challenge, because again, both cultures come at it from different angles. So if you're a startup culture, I think there's a challenge to getting like a more maturity and bringing a process and a even technology and process to something that you were willy-nilly and gave your devs full freedom to do whatever they felt like. When everyone's pushing to production, like, hey, sure, shove it all out there, that's excellent, until of course you're big enough that when you shove it all out there and it goes badly, you have, say, brand reputation, which matters a lot to, obviously, Coca-Cola, and now Snapchat matters a lot. You are a public company. So I think there's that aspect if you started as NoOps, and I think there's a need to move to a little bit more discipline. I think on the flip side, and I'm not going to speak to Coca-Cola because I haven't worked with you guys in detail, but I would say with a number of other companies we've worked with, there needs to be a buy-in from the top. So I don't think you can kind of piecemeal that through, and the reason is I see what will kill a company faster, or a DevOps model faster than anything, is if a team gets, small team gets a startup, they get to make some progress, they're moving some things along, and then they hit a wall, right? Well, if they're in a staid company, they hit a wall and it fails, and that team takes a hit, you'll never get DevOps going again, right? Because they took the hit for taking the risk in their career, and it won't happen. And so there needs to be buy-in from the top that that team has a chance to go run after it, and leadership knows there's a chance it'll fail, and when it does, they're rewarded for running after it, even if it didn't work. Again, fail fast, fail small. So I think you can move up and down that, but I think the North Star has to have solid leadership at the top in both directions that are willing to give us space to fail, because that's kind of what we're trying to do. We're trying to create, and it's pretty impossible, or the culture will not shift the second that problem happens and it's not acknowledged as a learning experience.
I agree with that, and I think at the top, and I think that the transition you're asking about depends on where you start. So the startups I've started, and I've had my same dose of failures and successes, but plenty of failures. By virtue of the nature of these things, you start at NoOps, right? It's usually me in my underwear, coding and alone, and with the cloud. Nobody wants to picture that, but that's pretty much
God, why did you say that?
And pizza on one side, donuts on the other.
Yeah, exactly, donuts and pizza. But in the case of Fandango, it's starting from the other side, which is legacy 10-year-old software and having to work backwards into even DevOps to NoOps. And I think that there's really three drivers. A lot of articles talk about this to even facilitate NoOps. There's the actual ecosystem, which is facilitated by the cloud, which a lot of these companies that we have didn't started before the cloud existed. There's then the software architecture that runs on top of that. Then there's the organizational structure and architecture, which I think is tightly coupled to the application architecture. So in the case of Fandango, we've had to re-architect all three of those layers to move towards a model where we now have a kind of a hybrid pattern where we have embedded DevOps, which is arguably NoOps when you start putting them into dev teams with just certain capabilities there. But that's been a gradual road. But to Brandon's point, the executive tier, it's been an immediate cut over to we're doing this. That was very much a binary decision.
I see. And when you talk about how to start, right? Let's imagine someone that starts in the low end of the spectrum and they want to roll out and move towards DevOps or more DevOps. Where can we start, right? How to identify the value streams that are the low-hanging fruits that are going to show quick results and that will help sell the DevOps rollout throughout the organization? What's the trick to find those? I
think the trick to some degree is stealth. I mean, I hear what you guys are saying about executive buy-in, and I agree that's a way to do it. But I don't think that most of the executives knew what we were doing when we were building out FIFA World Cup. And by the time they did, it was a win. It worked. We got a hacktivist anonymous attack and a major flood of packets, and Google scaled, and the attackers got bored, and we scaled back down.
Moved on to another target.
Yeah, and moved on to something that could actually affect. So I would say, I mean, it wasn't intentionally stealth, but in a way it was. And I know of a number of organizations that have experienced a stealth model. There are case studies out there on Barclays Bank. Essentially, they spun up a DevOps organization, very, very small. And it wasn't a formal contest, but effectively that organization was in a way pitted against their traditional way of rolling out software and capability. And so the proof being in the pudding and the eating. A really good way is to show better results, whether that's time, money, quality, etc.
In our case, similar, because we're a smaller company and tech at the senior CEO level, even as a CS guy, we didn't have to be stealthy, but we did have to deal with the break off a project. So what I did was came in and before trying to transform the major business, just broke off a team and tried to start instilling the culture of having systems thinking. A lot of it's just systems thinking. I found a lot of developers would just kind of code in a box and they had no idea what went on outside of that box. So we started a small team working on a project that they could actually manage soup to nuts themselves in the cloud to get those elements I mentioned before, architect everything in a certain way and take total ownership. And they were able to bring a product from idea to delivery within 3 months. Nobody at Fandango had seen that before, and they were like, "Oh my God, that's amazing!" And so that then created some institutional will to start pushing it across. Not in our case, it was less about executives, more about other developers. We had entrenched developers who were just like, "I don't do that."
I think that's really, really a key point, systems thinking. And I have other engineering other than software engineering as well. And for electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, systems thinking is hugely important. If you ship a piece of hardware in bulk and have to go do something with it, that's a very, very expensive proposition. Whereas software, we think of software as easy. And it isn't always that way, of course. And so there's been a lean tradition in manufacturing for a long time, and I think we're seeing that mirrored now in software, where we used to measure software engineers on throughput, how much code they got out there and features they built and everything else, and the quality was down in the QA department. But that's a very expensive way to develop, of course, and when systems thinking comes into it, it gets a lot more efficient. But developers having to think about that and to think about the ramifications of the code that they're writing now on the rest of the system is hugely important. It's broadly shift left, right? Shift up the stream, accountability.
And we've even seen that big shift just internal to Google. As we've shifted stuff to building out a cloud infrastructure, which is functionally just externalizing what Google uses outside, the work, the systems and everything, it would typically take a Google engineer 6 months at least to get up to speed on the tool sets and everything else internally. And so now when we acquire a company or new companies come in, they're just jumping right onto our public cloud, and we're seeing that speed even go faster. And then also interaction with the open source world has been something that has been, which kind of goes back to the tool sets, because I'd argue almost all the tool sets sit in an open source world for DevOps. That's been a fascinating process for us as well as we engage with Kubernetes or TensorFlow or even open source projects like Ansible or HashiCorp or you choose your DevOps tool set that you appreciate. That interaction's been one that's actually also increased, and then a lot of interesting conversations of, well, that tool set might be better than what we actually have internally.
Right.
And so
Evolutionary pressure, right?
No, it's been fascinating. It's been really, really good for the company.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about startups, right? And they can be very nimble. They are starting from zero, and no better time to go straight to a NoOps if you are just starting, right? So they can be super nimble. They can move really fast. They have been doing great in the DevOps space. But what I wonder is what bigger organizations could learn from the startups model and the way they are handling, the way they are succeeding with DevOps.
Yeah, well, one thing on that note, just I've been doing startups for 8 years. When I went into Fandango, that was kind of my whole framework, was thinking that way. So I mentioned all these different companies. We basically worked with the CEO and created a portfolio model where we just said, let's look at all these different groups, whether it's movie clips or movies.com or Fandango, as a portfolio of companies where we more operate like VCs, and we interact with the leadership teams for each product in the form of monthly board meetings, very much modeled after the way board meetings work for startups, and just empowered them to then manage themselves and focus on interacting with us through metrics and then talking about strategy. So in that sense, it was very much like the way startups work. In the case of the bigger properties that have larger revenue streams and more risk, then we had to get into more of this, really roll up the sleeves and dig in more like a big company. There's no avoiding it to get into more of a modern operational model. Whereas the newer things, like I mentioned, we could come out of the gate with a NoOps model and scale it that way. The thing we're getting into now, which I'm curious to know what you guys think, is we're trying to deal with economies of scale. So for instance, 5 payment platforms, you've got a huge risk surface area we get attacks all the time that we have to defend, and we don't want to have this large perimeter to defend. So we start to want to consolidate certain things. And I always talk about we don't want to always have bread lines where there's a service and all the different product guys are waiting for their feature. So we're trying to institute kind of an in-house open source model there where anybody can code on anything, but we have ownership that's very clear. But it's early days for us. I don't know if you guys have experienced that and had any hits or misses there.
We have for sure economies of scale issues. Coca-Cola, the Coca-Cola system is some 750,000 employees across hundreds and hundreds of bottlers, and where we can have economies of scale, we can win a lot more in the marketplace and the P&L. And in software, we have typically dealt with that by building large matrix organizations and centers of excellence. But that is pretty incompatible, frankly, with DevOps. And so the model that you're talking about is the one that we're considering, which is essentially in-house open source. And it's a little like Amazon's model as AWS was being developed. I'm not even sure they were certain that was going to be a commercial platform at the time, but delivering services internally that can be reused and improved upon, but with clear ownership.
Got it. Can you give me insight on how that's working inside of Google? Is that the way you guys operate, or?
We fundamentally come at it from, and I apologize, it'll be contrary to probably where you're coming from, is we come at it from a fairly different route. So one, the process at Google that we're now going through is an externalization of internal resources. So I think where, to your point, like Amazon's model was a pizza box team developed some code, or this is recorded, so I'll just say it anyway, taking open source code and putting lipstick on it. And it's good lipstick, don't get me wrong, but it's open source code that someone else developed. Sure. Which is fine. If anyone use open source? Okay, one request, can we please contribute back into the systems? So by the way, I didn't ask you to raise your hand and be like, hey, did you contribute that code you just wrote on top of back in? But if you don't, it's not sustainable. And likewise, we all have to do this because that's where the code comes. That's where you get actually both better code, right? And also, we got to look at making a sustainable model. Totally separate conversation on open source sustainability. But internally, we came at it from a systems of something that everything commits. For example, when you commit code, it all goes back to root, right? So we came at it from a little bit different angle than a whole bunch of pizza box teams. Some of it was just because of the way we developed and where we're coming with. So some of it is the way in which we developed. The core infrastructure all being container-based and everything was a lot more flexible than the SOA. So the service-oriented architecture is great, but once you abstract it out to VMs, then each service, while a lot more flexible, also requires a massive team to continue to develop it well. So that's the piece to watch for, depending on where you are, right? So at some point, there's a balance between the two of what your breadth of control would be. And I'm speaking from a cloud provider more than I am, your guys' view.
Right.
Sure.
So I think there's an agile piece to that, but then who's going to sustain that code? Who's going to maintain the code? how are you going to continue to innovate on the core underlying capabilities, right? So it's one to get it out. It's a question is like, then, okay, how do I forklift, my entire S3 infrastructure? Not easy, by the way. It's pretty tough to do that. How do you do so for us, we look at this problem from more of a systems view. So maybe back to the way you were talking of, hey, we have to systems architecture view of it.
Right.
We actually come at the whole thing that way. That's just the way, that's a mindset that Google goes at it.
It's also your core business.
It does have a hit, though, on innovation, or I should say speed. You do have a hit on speed, so you're kind of trading quality for speed. And I think that's a trade-off you'll hit no matter how you tackle it.
And talking about speed,
Yep.
it's a question that I have been saving for you is, what's the cost of this speed? Because we all know the benefits of using the NoOps tool set, right? So you have managed services, APIs, containers, everybody knows the pros of those, right?
Yep.
But what are the cons? This speed is coming at a cost?
Not if you've got a white sheet of paper and you're building something very specific with a small team. I think there is no cost. I think there's just a huge amount of benefit because basically you're getting $1 billion worth of technology, multiple billions in the case of coming onto Google's platform for free. You pay for what you use. So on the other hand, there is a lot of cost in converting teams. There's the fear factor, DevOps in an organization where there's a lot of existing operations, and there's just a lot of potential pitfalls. So that's hard. But if you have a clean sheet of paper, it's a great accelerator. I think you may have a different view.
No, I think we measure our whole view on ops. We have really three main metrics we look at. We look at the primary one right now that we really focus on is cycle time. So from idea to deployment, and we just measure the success of say, hey, without worrying about the details, if that's either going at a high rate and accelerating, then we're happy and let people kind of be autonomous. If it seems like there's problems there, we start to get involved and try to remove dysfunction from the system, wherever it may be. A lot of times it's actually pre-code. It's usually the requirements level and that sort of thing, dealing with people that still have waterfall mentalities. The other two metrics we look at are basically just, system reliability, uptime, classic metric there. So that's the kind of counterpoint on quality. And then mean time to resolve, which is more the DevOps, like if people are autonomous in a NoOps model, can they actually resolve their situations quickly? Can they not? When I first came in, it was like an hour to get people even on a bridge when we had an outage and a high level of dysfunction. So those are the three metrics we use to kind of measure things, and one of them is speed.
Do you measure reputation internally of developers and engineers?
Karma points, and we don't right now. Just haven't got. It's the kind of a thing we want to do, but we haven't just gotten there as a level of maturity.
At Google, or is that a secret?
As far as measurement, we measure a ton of things. We don't measure people on the amount of code they turn.
Not the amount. I'm talking about the reliability. The reason
yes. The quality. The quality reputation matters a ton. And back to, I think DevOps works great on something net new you're building.
Yeah.
And I think all the methodologies can be, fruitful across the board.
Yeah.
I think, at least, if I'm going to turn this internally to Google, so our goal is to build a platform that people can, that functionally they can start with no one, right, or with a NoOps model, and then again, as needed, break glass down or up, I guess, depending on how you want to think of the stack, but start with as little overhead as possible and just let the developer run at it. And then as they evolve, allow you to break glass if you need to have more control.
Sure.
So that's the methodology that we are trying to enable externally. But from an internal standpoint, the reputational risk is massive, right? So the platform itself is expected. You may interact with Google and there's things you'll expect. And one of the things is technical excellence, right? If you come to Google, you expect the product to be, the fastest, the most reliable. These are all things that come with our reputation as an engineering company. And something we pride ourselves a lot on, that those underlying tool sets, the underlying services are the best in the business. And so we're also building that in conjunction with Scale and a whole lot of other services. So ours is probably internally a little bit in the middle because of what the nature of what we're building. It's not all greenfield, and it has to interact with a large number of back-end systems. And every time you roll it out, you're like, okay, so how does this scale to being able, like, how can Coca-Cola handle this problem and never have to think about it, right? So the engineering problem, I think a lot of it depends a lot on what your engineering problem is too. If you're building massive distributed systems, it's not really a DevOps. It doesn't lend itself nearly as well to a DevOps model.
Yeah.
But we'd love to enable everyone else to do the DevOps.
I was asking about reputation and shift left because I tend to come at it as from a cultural organization, as much more so than just obviously tools and process are important, but that's not typically been our problem in large enterprise. It's been the cultural. So I like to tell the story of when Coke, massive Coke, went and talked to little bitty Facebook when they were only 20 million, and had a few dozen developers, and we went in. Usually we're greeted by the CEO when we go see smaller companies, but no, Zuckerberg is heads down coding, has headphones on, doesn't look up. I noticed that there was this table in the middle of the floor, and it had a lot of bottles of booze on it, and I thought, wow, maybe this looks like a great place to work. Is this for the developers? No, that was the QA department. And I said, oh, well, tell me more. And the developers were held to account on the quality of their code. And if they had a lot of access at that time, I don't know how they run it now, but a lot of access to get code into production almost immediately. But if you break Facebook, that could have an immediate impact on the rest of your life. Your stock options, your employment at Facebook. So if a QA guy happened to catch your mistake before it made it into production, they often got a nice bottle of booze out of it. And nobody was calling it DevOps at that point. At Facebook, they were talking about accountability upstream. And I think that's the cultural takeaway for me, as figuring out how to get there is the most important point. And by the way, that's not just relevant to DevOps. That's relevant to any kind of software engineering.
And that's a topic that, talking to you guys before, almost every single one of you touched on that, right? So how important is cultural and practices changes in the DevOps success versus the technology and processes, right? So what I heard from you all in different situations is that people tend to forget about cultural changes, new practices, and they focus completely on technology and
That's
process.
the most important part. I mean, the tool, you can do this with millions of combinations of tools. People do argue about which containerization technology is the best, and whether it's Jira or not Jira or whatever. But that's the least important, I think.
And how can we help the focus to start or remain in culture and practices instead of technology? Did you guys have any ideas on that?
Sure. Well, it goes kind of back to what Thomas was mentioning about karma. That we see it at Fandango is DevOps is culture. Everything else, like the tools and the process, that's all feeds the culture, and the culture feeds the tools, and it all kind of is a cycle. But it's basically culture. We kind of three points. We had the first point I mentioned, which was systems thinking, and that was the first cultural problem, and that was the idea of breaking into smaller teams, given the wide span of control over a small product scope versus very small span of control over a large product scope, which is what I first saw. Second cultural kind of focus was blameless postmortems, because as they started to take more control, there was this whole issue of everybody is afraid to fail. So we had to start instituting this notion of blameless postmortems, which is really common in the industry, but wasn't common in that particular culture. And then that's why when I mentioned karma, we're not there yet, because I want to get people feeling fearless and getting away from the blame. And then you can start introducing karma
that's a great
around,
point.
kind of motivating more gamification around people striving for a higher level of quality and higher level achievement that's more self-motivated. So those are the 3 phases we've been looking at.
I think that's very wise, is to hold off on the karma until, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we still find that when things get intense around, especially around the more commerce-focused, this weekend I was dealing with a lot of this, where we've got a lot of revenue at stake. You can quickly get into Lord of the Flies, right, with the developers trying to hold things up. So it's important to keep the ownership level high. You've got to keep the blame level low.
That's right. Yeah, and you have to stop you have, by putting dev and ops together. You have to stop this. Oh, it's an operational issue. Oh no, it's an engineering issue.
Right. Definitely.
What about the Google, Brendan?
So I think from cultural standpoint, I mean, we're coming at it, as a company, we come at it from not having, so we wouldn't have the challenge of the borders, but we still do fundamentally have a dev and ops world, to be totally transparent, and we actually have surfaced that. If anyone's heard of an SRE, right?
Yeah.
So this is our goal. So a site reliability engineering, if you reversed 5 years ago, was like, hey, that's operations, which was sort of half a dirty word, right? But it's a really, really hard job for someone to do it really well. And so it's important to say, first off, giving people both a career path and a direction was something that we thought was really important. And I think, pretty happy to see that that's a pretty universal now across the industry, and SRE's pretty well known, and it's also a very highly esteemed role. And if we went 5 years ago, I think we'd see differently.
Didn't you guys have like an ex-Navy SEAL or some crazy guy running, a famous SRE guy in Google?
Yeah, I think that would have landed under Ben Traynor.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
And now the flip side now is, in terms of both the culture and how we handle this, is internally to Google, you're handing off to an SRE. So you're like, I'm going to develop my product, and then there's all the detailed handoff to run it to an operations or an SRE. And that SRE is viewed as your best friend and also your hardest critic, because they're going to take it on. Like, I'm going to take on ownership of your service once you've written it.
So Diane, is she the head of the platform stuff?
She runs cloud.
She runs cloud. So she said to us at Coke, we came to visit, she said that in developing a new product, that essentially that team held the pager. I'm sure it's not a pager anymore, but until it achieved that sort of reliability where the pager would never buzz, and then it would be handed over.
Yeah, so the team develops the product, then they hand it off for running to an SRE, and the SRE has very high bars of what you've monitoring and other things in there. So they offer, they function as the checkpoint to saying, here's what it takes to run a service at scale, is where an SRE would be. And then where we've really now leaned in trying to, as we kind of come out of our shell into a public cloud and started to look around and talk to all of you, what we found is that it's really important also to have the other side of the equation, which is we call customer reliability engineering, or a CRE. So we launched this year, and that is all about, hey, how do we help a customer, right, functionally understand what the SRE would do, right? So they are now taking on that role with our customers to say, here's the bar you would need to get to be able to hand a service over to Google, right? Because right now, the problem with the public cloud is it's like, here's a couple white papers, and hopefully you follow this pattern, and good luck, it works, right? Yeah. Is that's what we're all doing, and functionally, that's a terrible situation for customers. It's a terrible situation for Google or any provider as well, because the call comes in, is it running? Your VM's up and running, but I have no idea what the heck's in it, right? So there's never been any process to help make sure that that goes through, and what's being run is something that can be troubleshot, can be supported, and can be delivered on. And so, and functionally, we've motivated this weird behavior in the industry. We're like, hey, we changed also in terms of this to get very personal, right? So last week, we're like, hey, this needs to be personal, and the way we're going to do this is we're going to have our customers, no matter whatever size. If you want support, it's cheap. But you have to have a named person on the other end of the phone call, right? And so what that is accountability, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to put a Google engineer on the other side of a phone, but it needs to be in a point that I can talk to someone that knows what the heck the service is. Because I don't want just 40 JIRA tickets coming in to the same question, and like, none of you that just sent 40 tickets to me, can I respond to, because none of you know your service, right? So if you don't know your service, I need to have that interaction so that we can have this handoff, right?
Right.
So, I mean, DevOps inside your own world is easy because you go front to back and you run the data center to the beginning.
Right.
You can think through that process. That hasn't been well thought through, in my opinion, in the public cloud at all, right? It's like developed, hopefully here it's sort of get to this white paper, and then I hope it just might work when I hand it over.
Well, there's a whole industry that has emerged because of that lack of development, and particularly around Amazon's cloud.
Yeah, so I think, and hopefully this actually, I mean, we're doing this, hopefully this works across all. Like this becomes a piece in which people think about the problem as an evolution. Public cloud DevOps, it's sort of the operation side of the DevOps. So we'll see.
We are reaching the mark that we had reserved to open for questions in the audience, if you don't mind. We have a few questions here in the Slido. And if you guys don't have the app, or if you want to ask in person, feel free to get the mic. The first one that we have here, the most voted one, is how to develop mature DevOps practices.
Mature DevOps practices.
Yes.
Well, start doing them and iterating them. that's the short answer. I think, that's what but seriously though, it sounds silly, but it's true, I think. So we just try to, like I mentioned before, break into smaller teams, let them run their process end to end, let them iterate those processes, do a lot of retros, and then have some facility for cross-pollinating between teams of what they've learned and about what worked and what didn't learn.
I love what you said earlier about having teams with very wide coverage on relatively small scopes, and I've been describing that as verticalizing development as much as possible. So multifunctional teams focusing on one goal, which in our case may be a machine or a FIFA World Cup or whatever it is, but as much as possible having that team with essentially a common focus, and that's very suited to DevOps. Mm-hmm. So look hard at your matrix, I would say. It's very, very hard to do this if you are highly matrixed, because you get different accountabilities and different priorities from the horizontal than you do the vertical.
Mm-hmm. Any tips from you?
Both very solid. I'll just stick to those.
Great. The next one that I have here. Oh, sorry.
Thanks. Do you see hybrid cloud merely as being a stair step to NoOps, or do you see use cases that would benefit from remaining in that architecture?
Okay, Mike, I don't think I'll get in any serious trouble for saying this, but I think hybrid cloud comes out of a couple of things. One is regulatory, and the other is ignorance. There's not a lot of advantage, in my view. The work it takes from going to on-prem to hybrid cloud is the same going from on-prem to cloud. The same complexities are there, and maybe more so. But the ignorance factor is strong. There's a tendency, and actually Coca-Cola has been very progressive on this, but there is a tendency in boardrooms across America and otherwise to think that our intellectual capital in our data center is more secure and is more reliable than if it's outside. And that's where the ignorance comes in. And I think as technologists, we have to counter that and explain, it would maybe basic concepts to us, but encryption, and that Google or Amazon have hundreds of people that are pen testing their platforms all the time, and they're designed to be very, very secure. And by the way, we can hold our own keys. Not even Google can look at our stuff. I think a lot of the argument for hybrid cloud goes away. At least for us. I mean, there are, we were talking about breaking the glass downward. There are certainly companies that need to innovate outside the realm of what they could do in the cloud. But For most of us, I don't think there's a big reason for hybrid. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I'll see you on your ignorance and regulatory issues, because I've dealt with tons of those, and raise you with cost and legacy. So definitely, I dealt with a lot of people that had no cloud experience. So that was the ignorance side. I had to definitely, and we still are working through it. It's been like an awakening. It's just like, this is like the 60s, but the nerd version of it. Instead of LSD, it's like the cloud. Oh my God, you know.
Yeah.
It's really been astounding to watch some developers just start working in it, just the way they change. On the regulatory side, we've kind of overcome a lot. Now we're running full MPAA certified pipelines from mezzanine file from studios all the way to CDN, fully in the cloud. Took a while to get there, but we've gotten there. On the cost side, we're still working through that. We've got two big pieces, I think. One is just the CapEx, OpEx piece.
Sure.
I don't know what you guys are doing with it, but there are schemes to be able to capitalize cloud costs, but we're still early in that. And it seems like it varies by company even.
It does, for sure.
I don't do accounting.
Pardon?
I can't do accounting.
You don't do accounting?
I can
Okay.
save you 40-50%, but I can't do your accounting.
So that's been a big challenge, is just working through that, the CapEx, OpEx side. So you can capitalize all this stuff in a data center, and if you already have sunk cost, if you walk into a company like I didn't have it, and then you have to kind of deal with your CFO on how do you can't just throw all that out, without him.
No, it's a good point. It's painful, but we're forcing ourselves to do this by we've put our last data centers up for sale.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, there's still buyers for data centers.
Oh, you are?
But that's put a sort of stake in the ground in a way.
Definitely.
And it means that we're really not accepting anything new in that data center. So anything new is going straight to cloud, and
we're pretty
everything
much that way,
there is being moved out.
Yes, we're in the same boat you're in there. And then the other part of cost is just one of the whole benefits of cloud and the cost is we have a spiky business with movies, movie releases, et cetera. And so that's incredible optimization you can get. But we do have less mature development teams in a hurry, and they'll basically turn the spigot on and then forget to turn it off and not set up auto scaling and stuff. So, and then we'll see a big cost overrun. So getting your teams to be more mature that way and manage the cost is really a critical part of the equation.
So I'm going to take an interesting side of this. I think hybrid is both alive and a really good way to think of it. And you may find that odd as a public cloud provider. But I actually think the thought process is extraordinarily important. So the process of thinking of being able to be in a hybrid, you may decide to deploy one place or whatever, but think about the world as if you would want to be in a hybrid environment, because the future you will want this flexibility. The future you needs to have thought through how that process, or the tool sets, whether you go open or closed environment. I'm obviously going to advocate predominantly towards an open environment. You don't know where your business will work, and we've seen it go both directions with customers, and I think that's the question of where on the stack do you want to do your optimization. But if you go into it with, I'm only interested in Agile, you'll paint yourself into an interesting corner in most cases that your future you may hate you, right? So I do think the notion of hybrid, even if you are only going to go to a public cloud, right, as these two have both gone and are looking at going, thinking about the notion of, do I have the ability, if I needed to go back into a private cloud or another public cloud? I think that's a really important way to think of it. So I think it's a mentality that I think people look at and go, well, hybrid cloud, and everyone disses on it, and the jokes are always, if you have no strategy, go with hybrid. Well, it's a mentality. Have you thought through from a system standpoint what it's going to look like if you needed to move that thing?
That's an important point, and not just because you want to come back into private, but because it may make sense over time to move between Google and Amazon and Microsoft and IBM for various reasons. But I will say that is that kind of portability today is very, very hard. But that's certainly something that we are looking at for business. I mean, we've been around a lot longer than any of these technology companies that are starting up, and we think we'll still be here when they're gone. So we want to be able to move across as we can.
There's another question here. highly ranked. What changes, cultural, technological, or otherwise, to monitoring and logging do you find critical to transition to NoOps?
Yes, you have to have monitoring and logging, and you better do it really well.
Totally.
I get from the tool set, so it says monitoring, logging, like there's a bunch of good tool sets out there, so I think probably advocating on a tool set's fine. I would say if you have someone that shows up that is really wed to tool sets, that is a like alarm bell for me when I'm working with a team, right? If someone is that opinionated and or more importantly, they approach a problem with a solution, like, hey, it should be this tool set. Maybe it should, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, right? And I'm stealing liberally from a guy named Kelsey Hightower, if you ever want to watch. He's our advocate for Kubernetes. And he always approaches it with, okay, what's the problem and what are we trying to solve, right? And he never takes religion on tool sets, right? And I think that's something I would look for in the people you hire, in the culture that you're working in, because by definition you may want to change that. By definition, in this tool set, I happen to be, for example, a big fan of Ansible and HashiCorp. Well, guess what? Were those around? Did those exist 3 years ago? No, right? So getting wed to a tool set, like, yeah, you may need to standardize it. I'm not saying you shouldn't standardize on something, but when someone comes in with really strong opinions on that, it's sort of a red flag to me on a person.
Agree.
And if they don't want to put monitoring and logging, or they don't know how to do that, then that's also a challenge, right? Because you're like, I don't know how I can't help you, right?
Yeah.
I can't, best practice, I can't hand that over an SRE if they can't tell me what's going on inside of it.
That's back to me, the indication that you don't have a systems thinker if they don't get the value of logging, monitoring, alerting. Yeah, so I think as a CTO of Etsy was quoted, like, graph all the things, so definitely a believer in that. Obviously, you never get there and you have to prioritize, but it's a huge part of what we do. And that's back to the horizontal versus these vertical companies running as little startups. We try to provide a common approach to logging, monitoring, alerting, and once again, not religious about what the tools are, but trying to be consistent just because it's difficult at scale to deal with a heterogeneous system in that regard.
That's for sure. I mean, picking those things that have to be in common is very important. And then allowing the evolution to happen is also important. So, have fun.
We live in a very bureaucratic environment. Every application requires the authority to operate. Do you guys have any suggestions on how to kind of break that down, or work with those folks to kind of improve that environment, get more towards something like this?
Well, we're going through that now, and I come back to focus teams with accountability, and I don't know what your organization looks like, but you say it's very bureaucratic, which tends to lead me to believe that there are probably a lot of horizontals that have to sign off on lots of different things. I think you can do this without major org change. We spun up a very, very boring HR project recently at Coca-Cola. It's a very important one, but HR projects really, they really get you out of bed in the morning, right? But it was so important that we got the leadership, the steering committee, the executives to assign members that were on their horizontal teams to this vertical project and dedicate the team to effectively this multifunctional team to solving one set of problems and to delivering one thing of value. And that's had a enormously positive impact on what's $20-30 million project to do something across all of our associates worldwide. So I think that putting the organization together that lives and dies together effectively, they win or lose together, is massively important to breaking down the bureaucratic shuffle.
I totally agree with that. I've dealt with that same thing with certain department heads out of tech who just insist on having a very monolithic structure where things go up the chain for approval. And we just, back to pick a small project to start with and say, just give us a point person and empower that person. Just try it. Just experiment with something that's maybe not business critical. And the second thing is, for me anyway, what I experienced with the executives that were that way was trying to get them to go towards being more metrics driven. So I dealt with a lot of the like old white guys, very Hollywood, like old white guys in a boardroom. Like the kids these days, they want to see X. Like we're all old white guys. We don't know what the kids want to see. Let's just put stuff out there and like let the metrics tell us what they want to see. And it took about 6 months, and now it's all metrics driven, and they're fully on board. But it was by starting a small project, narrow team, give us a person to represent you, trust us, and then use the metrics at like a board member. Yeah. That was our playbook.
We're running out of time, and there's one last question that I wanted to throw at you guys here from Slido. I get the point that there is a cultural shift from classic to DevOps, but what's the exact change from DevOps to NoOps?
I personally, like I said, I'm skeptical at scale of a full-blown DevOps or NoOps migration, just because there's certain things, like even Netflix, they say like things like your CapEx, OpEx planning. There's certain functions that still are centralized like that. Your tier 1 support, most teams really like having a centralized NOC. Some will sign up, but so my view is the main way is to take your DevOps team, what we're doing anyway, is embed them in the actual dev teams. So that's where you go NoOps. But you typically, I would think, hold back some central services just because it is more practical. You can always try a radical approach, but the first step to me would be that embedded process.
I agree. I think it's a continuum, and it's almost like there's this city on the hill, and you can never quite reach. Although you should strive to in many ways. I mean, things that can be automated that don't require human interaction or where human mistakes could cause you a lot. Amazon's data center a few weeks ago on the East Coast was a fat finger problem, right? And I'm sure they're looking at ways to automate around those processes. So I think that I think that's the answer. I don't think there is any clear-cut definition change between DevOps and NoOps, and I don't think you are likely ever to get all the way there, except in very specific circumstances.
Actually, I like to do polls whenever I'm on a panel because it's like the one time I can. But raise your hand if you're affected by the Amazon outage. I'm just curious to see how. Wow, that was pretty widespread.
Yeah.
Pretty widespread.
It's a business opportunity for you guys.
That's right.
I didn't say it. You said it. I didn't say it. But I mean, I did think it. I mean, it certainly was one of those like fascinating.
You're welcome.
You're welcome, Tom.
Yeah. I don't.
You can make the check out to my foundation.
I will. Yeah, we'll check on that. I'm not particularly sure I'm yet convinced, having seeing people start with NoOps and then having to move to DevOps. I mean, I think there's a need for ops. If you scale and you grow, and you're going to get legacy. I mean, you're going to get other stuff that comes along that requires people to operate it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's almost a sign that's look like it's negative. I think some good startups, like either you're going to fail and you'll still be NoOps because you got no one,
Exactly.
or you move to where you have an ops team.
That's right.
And so,
Part of maturity.
right, yeah, and same. I think a lot of it is predicated on the systems you're building, like very much on what kind of systems are you building, and how long are they going to be around, right? So I think, all the stuff we did around FIFA World Cup was awesome. Probably not a need for, that's definitely a NoOps model. Like, hey, build it, it's great, it's a point in time. That flag I think is probably still out there that people go find them, which is great, right? But it's like that is pretty much done and moved on with. And there's projects, your HR is going to not be a NoOps solution. Just won't be.
No, of course not.
And so I think there's...
That's right.
Yeah, but exactly, we haven't touched the flag application a year and a half now, and it's still humming along. Probably costs us about 27 cents an hour to run.
That's a good point, by the way. In our world too, like commerce versus media-driven applications and businesses, vastly different, and so you have to customize everything for the situation, right? There's no one-size-fits-all. That process methodologies, when I was younger in my career, I remember the XP movement was big, and I tried to install that like by the letter, and that was, and of course it blew up in my face, and that was when I realized, you got to customize everything for the context, and so that applies to all this too.
Well, I'm going to have to wrap up here. We are running out of time. I would like to thank you for being here and talking to us. I would like to thank you guys for being here as well. And you're welcome to the lounge across the hall to talk more.